You know that small rush you feel when someone praises you? When they say, "You did great," or click that little heart under your post. It's subtle but warm, almost electric. You feel seen. And for a brief moment, you feel enough. But when the feeling fades, you start chasing it again. You check if they've replied yet. You reread old messages, old comments, old moments where someone reminded you that you mattered. And slowly, without realizing it, your sense of self begins to orbit around the approval of others. You tell yourself it's normal. Everyone wants to be liked. And that's true. But somewhere along the way, seeking connection becomes something else. It becomes dependence. We talk a lot about addiction to dopamine, to social media, to work, but rarely about the quietest one of all, the addiction to validation. Why do compliments feel so powerful? Why does being ignored hurt more than we admit? And what happens when your worth depends on who's watching?
You probably think the desire for validation is harmless, just part of being human. You want to be appreciated, recognized, understood. You want to know that your efforts mean something, that you're not invisible. And in many ways, that's perfectly natural. As children, we learned through approval. A smile from a parent meant we were good. A scolding meant we weren't. We internalized that love had conditions, that belonging required proof. So you grew up trying to earn it, through achievements, good grades, polite smiles, and doing what was expected. The world rewarded you for it. Praise made you feel loved, but criticism made you feel unsafe. As an adult, the pattern didn't vanish. It just evolved. Now, validation comes in subtler forms. Likes, compliments, promotions, attention. Each one gives you a hit of relief, a signal that you still matter, that you're not falling behind. But the comfort doesn't last, because the approval isn't yours, it's borrowed. And borrowed worth always expires. So you keep refreshing, comparing, chasing. You post something new hoping it lands. You replay conversations, wondering if you sounded smart enough. You measure your value by how others respond. And when they don't, you start shrinking inside yourself. It looks like ambition, like drive, like care. But beneath it is a quiet panic. Who am I if no one's looking? That's the part most people never question. They see validation as harmless encouragement. But the truth goes deeper than that. Because what feels like connection is often a disguised search for safety.
Psychologically, validation operates like a reward system, a feedback loop wired into your brain. When someone praises you, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical triggered by gambling or caffeine. It feels good, so you want more. And slowly, the brain begins to associate external approval with internal safety. That's why disapproval or even silence can feel threatening. Your nervous system reacts as if your belonging is at risk. It's not just emotional, it's biological. And this loop deepens with repetition. Every time you get validation, your brain reinforces the link between approval and self-worth. So you start adjusting your behavior, not to express who you are, but to earn that feeling again. Psychologists call this contingent self-esteem, a fragile sense of worth that depends on external confirmation. You start curating yourself, only showing what's likable, agreeable, admired. You suppress emotions that might disappoint. You play roles you didn't choose, the reliable one, the funny one, the perfect one. And when no validation comes, your mind doesn't just feel empty, it feels unsafe. Because deep down, your brain still believes that without approval, you could lose love. In childhood, that belief made sense. Love often was conditional. But in adulthood, the danger isn't real anymore. Still, the body doesn't know the difference. So every like, every compliment, every nod becomes a miniature survival cue. It's not vanity, it's a form of self-soothing. You're not addicted to attention, you're addicted to reassurance. And reassurance, like any drug, works only for a moment. Then the crash comes, and the craving follows. That's why people keep seeking louder approval, more followers, more recognition, more proof. Because somewhere inside, the brain still whispers, if they see me, I'm safe. If they don't, I disappear.
Imagine you've just shared something meaningful, a project, a photo, a thought. At first, people respond. You feel proud, seen, alive. Then the notifications stop. The silence stretches. Suddenly, the same thing that made you happy now makes you anxious. You start wondering if it was enough. You question your talent, your relevance, even your identity. That's how validation addiction quietly rewires your emotional landscape. It turns joy into performance. You no longer do things because they feel right. You do them because they'll be received well. You start filtering your creativity through the imagined gaze of others. And when you can't meet that imagined standard, you retreat. You stop expressing altogether. Because silence now feels like rejection, and rejection feels like danger. In relationships, it shows up subtly. You over-explain yourself to avoid being misunderstood. You apologize too quickly to keep the peace. You give more than you receive because giving earns appreciation, and appreciation feels like oxygen. But eventually you realize something painful. The people around you aren't seeing you anymore. They're seeing the version you created to stay loved, and that version is exhausting to maintain. There's a quiet loneliness that comes from being constantly approved of, but never truly known. Because deep connection doesn't come from validation. It comes from vulnerability. And vulnerability means being seen, not just for your best parts, but for the ones that might disappoint. The validation addiction hides that truth. It teaches you that love must be earned, that worth must be proven, that peace must be given to you from the outside. But all of that is an illusion. The more you chase validation, the further you drift from authenticity, and ironically, from the kind of love that lasts.
The truth is, your mind doesn't crave validation. It craves belonging. It craves the feeling of being safe to exist as you are. But somewhere along the way, you confused approval with acceptance. Approval depends on performance. Acceptance doesn't. You can't stop wanting to be seen. That's human. But you can notice when being seen turns into needing to be approved. You can ask yourself, would I still do this if no one clapped? Would it still matter if no one noticed? The first few times, the answer might sting, because real worth feels quiet at first, almost too quiet. But over time, you'll begin to sense something steadier, something that doesn't rise and fall with other people's opinions. That's self-trust, and it's the only kind of validation that doesn't fade. You don't need to earn it. You only need to return to it, again and again, until your brain learns that safety was never out there. It was always within you. Because the opposite of validation isn't indifference. It's peace. And peace begins the moment you stop performing and start existing as someone who no longer needs permission to be enough.